Storytelling Work, Lesson 1. These days, I'm learning to comprehend that the devils know not whom they serve, and that the whole truth and notion is false faith in the overarching evil enemy entity, represented by the one world government, absolute belief in overarching conspiracies. People put more faith in the Antichrist than having faith and belief in the salvation of souls. Do you know why Jesus got arrested? Do you know what Jesus got charged with? Do you know what Jesus was convicted of? Have you ever thought about why this story? This story is the corner foundation stone of law in the Western world. Thus, to swear on the Bible is to acknowledge the truth set out in the story, called the New Testament. As far as I can tell from my own storytelling abilities, the story is a simple psychological masterpiece, but the sense and moral of the story depends on who is telling the story, who is nuancing the narrative, who is skipping over specific details, and how well the overall punchlines are delivered. A typical story narrative. Kinda normal guy, just doing his own thing, but something's happen in a series of events which disrupt the guy's normal way of life. Something novel is happening to his normal. The novel narrative takes him through a transformation where ultimately he must face himself. In reflection of the outside world conspiring, he faces certain death, yet somehow survives, and the whole process was well worthwhile. So long as the normal guy follows through, takes a series of steps, and trusts that the steps add up, one step at a time, and in the end, the steps have become a whole stairway. If you commit to taking the first steps as the steps are laid out before your feet, and to trust in faith with each step taken that the next step will reveal itself presently, until the step-by-step process gives rise to ascending a stairway to heaven, step by step, guided by a faith in a higher self-intelligence, guided by the ancestral wisdom, gathered from the generations who have lived through the ages of reiterations of incarnations, to garner, to collect something, usually after much work or with difficulty. So, as a storyteller, I know we all tell stories every day. We psychologically relate our impressions as expressions. We repeat the same stories of all our lives, condensing the storylines into concise slices as we grow older into eventually accepting wisdom. Thus, a natural development of old wives' tales, thus a collective fairy tales, folk wisdom traditions, and thus the oral traditions of folklore and living mythologies reincarnating. Thus, the power of the bard in past Gaelic society, for the storyteller has a natural ability to incorporate the challenges being faced at the times, each new generation facing the novel changes as the overall evolution continually expands in complexity from tribal simplicity to modern global conspiracies. Thus, the various Bibles which compile these oral expressions of impressions garnered to thousands of reiterations of the common experiences of primitive man surviving the wilderness, of the nomadic families settling on a promised land, of the negotiations with neighbouring settlements, of various versions of invasions and theft and violence, of defending territory, chattel and crops from invaders, of enslavement, warfare and subjection to foreign rule, of keeping the native traditions and freedoms alive while living under suppression of native identity customs, of awaiting a saviour, great leader to be revealed, of attempted insurrection rising up around the hero, of the native peoples regaining their native freedoms, of confederacies of tribal agreements to keep peace, of developments of systems of governing, laws. Laws are essentially God's commandments. Laws are hard-boiled eggs that don't go sour. Laws have withstood the tests of time. Laws are derived from unconscious, self-evident truths. laws are agreed over millennia of common sense consent. So, back straight to the Jesus story. The story captures the listeners through their imaginations. The listeners follow along enraptured, captured, and project their identity onto the characters unfolding their destinies. Novel advancements reiterating eternal themes, the new normal, the New Testament, the new interpretation of the canons of laws, the new international grassroots movement, the new universal Catholic Church, Roman Empire, the new European Enlightenment, the new European nationalist empires, the new mystical technology of enlightenment, the new world wars 1 and 2, the new democracy, gold standard economy, the new universal interfaith of global Scientology, the new League of United Nations, the new technological global world order, the new artificial intelligence system. Ooh, that's quite novel. The new realization of salvation logarithmic equation, which is Christ light shone in the ark, cast shadows in material terrain. Christ creates 2,000-year-long shadow, which is reflected in our 2,000 years experience. An Antichrist is inherently initiated by Christ action, as in Plato's cave analogy. So, my short version telling of the Jesus story. A nice guy from an exiled old but deposed royal lineage among one of the tribes is born bright and beautifully, precociously intelligent, with an inner-innocence of loving nature. He's born in a time when there is an overarching military empire ruling over many nomadic tribes in a conquered region, steeped in the history of ages of various traditions. There has been a local prophecy for many generations foretelling the birth of a new hero saviour who will lead his people in their quest for sovereign independence. In telling this story, I, the storyteller, knows that I am speaking for all native peoples who have been defeated by dominating culture, with superior military organisation throughout all time, and that children look to their elders to entertain their imaginations with stories. For all storytellers know that get bored. Children get bored if not entertained. For all children inherently know that they get into trouble soon after they get bored. So, stories begin simple and universal, teaching simple, self-evident truths of heroes who have adventures like the adventures we all have. And this little baby boy was like any baby, born innocent of any adultery or sin. When this boy was born, his family called him an Iasc, the fish. And as a boy, his people called him Isa. Now also, you see, I must tell you that once upon a time, there was a Roman emperor who was scared of a story that was told of a saviour to be born, and would grow up to defeat the emperor and destroy his dynastic empire inheritance. So he decided to have every firstborn boy to be murdered in their homes by his soldiers. But even so, the family of this one baby boy was good-hearted and honestly intelligent. They were a noble lineage of people who followed the way of love and peace, and they did not seek to destroy any empires, for this family was still wise, nomadic peoples. And so they were travelling when their baby was born, and the soldiers did not find them in the houses. And because the emperor had been assured by his soldiers that his wish had been fulfilled, he believed he had defeated the heroic enemy before he would have a chance to grow up. Let me pause here to say that this story so far applies to the psychology of all infant mortality, no matter what the cause, instilling the belief in the family tribe that though childhood is ridiculously difficult to survive for infinities of ludicrous reasons, even so, nature nurtures and God guides, love protects the faithful. Well, when Isa was 12 years old, he travelled with his mum and dad, and on a journey to the capital city, one time they suddenly noticed that the boy had disappeared, and they panicked for a moment. Their child had been stolen, for such things were feared and known to happen, especially in the biggest cities. And they rushed about in the area where they had noticed that Isa was missing, but they could not sight nor scent of him nearby. but they could not see sight nor scent of him nearby. So they calmed their breath for a moment, and cleared their hearts and minds, and prayed to God in this moment, asked, "Where could our Isa be?" And their intuition responded, "Go ascend the steps of the temple. There you will find higher perspective and more will be revealed." So Isa's parents, Mary and Joe, rushed up the stone steps of the temple, and they looked back down to the crowded square, but they could still not see their boy Isa anywhere. But before fears could drown their ears with panic, they stilled their hearts and listened, and lo and behold, they both could hear Isa speaking behind their backs, and turned to see the strangest unexpected occurrence. Isa was speaking to the elders of the temple, and they were all listening to Isa, and their faces all looked stunned and amazed, for Isa spoke scriptures like poetry, drawing symbols in the sand with a stick. When they'd asked him how come he knew the scriptures off by heart while so young, Isa had simply answered, "My father knows." Saying so, Isa walked away from the elders and rejoined with his parents on their way, and the boy Isa was not seen again. End of Acts 1. Jesus Christ, would you look at the time?
Because you more than anyone has heard me telling these little scraps of, hey man, the Jesus story isn't wrong, it's just badly told. And because of some things come up in life, every now and then I go, that's a parable. What we're experiencing here, that's in the parables. What we're experiencing here, like this happens to people. And the thing about the parables is that they just pop into your mind because it's the pattern that we're seeing in the now. That pattern has been seen before, and that's what makes the parables happen. How come the miracle of parables exist in language? It's because these things keep happening and recurring and recurring and recurring. Same old story, different ways. But the pattern is like, of all the things that's a bit different about all these stories, there's something that's similar in all of them. And I didn't start out as a kid being told I would be a storyteller. It just was something people began saying, wow, you're a great storyteller, over the years. And I was like, well, whatever. You're interrupting me with the flow of thought I had there, but thanks for the comment. As the years went on, I became fairly convinced that I had a version of the Jesus story based on my own life interpretation of my story. So that instead of studying scriptures, what it was is that I had been experiencing the similarities between what I've heard of the Jesus story represents in my inner imagining, and seeing that play out in my life in hindsight, and then starting to see that playing out in my life in the moment, and then shifting into how I would act if I was a hero. And then for years with the fairy tale, I was going around speaking this poetry, which was in itself a reiteration of what the Jesus story says. So in my interpretation of the Jesus story, Jesus is a storyteller who went around and told stories. Rather than calling him a healer or a religious man, he was just a guy who had figured out something in himself and was telling a story that had come from inside himself, and he was trying to live that story. And the story becomes very famous. And so the question I have as a kid is, why is the Jesus story become so famous that everybody knows it? And so that's what's heroic about that story. It's the story of a little kid who's just a nobody, who disappears and comes back as a grown-up. And when he comes back as a grown-up, he's been travelling and he's seen loads of things in loads of lands. And the problem that he's seen the pattern so clear that when he describes the pattern, everyone understands it. It's like the Tower of Babel somehow hasn't affected his ability to speak in tongues to every tribe, not just his own tribe. And yet that story is such a dramatic story, because there's a normal-ish beginning. Okay, he's a novel guy, but then his life is fairly normal, apart from the one time that he gets lost and ends up in the temple. But apart from that, we know nothing about his childhood. He's just a guy. Yeah, that's genius in storytelling, that he's just a guy, but there's something different about him. But it's not until he's nearly 30 years old and he's going through his Saturn return that he starts to face his own Saturn. And facing his own Saturn is represented by the 40 days in the desert and all these childish projections of becoming ruler of an army that would rise up against the Romans and overthrow them. And he's like, no, that's not the way. Or childish imaginations that because his bloodline family were once well renowned and rulers, but that was thousands of years ago or something, that even so his bloodline could resurrect in truth and bring about a good order of society again, instead of the order that rules society under the Romans, which is crucifying innocent people just to uphold its own reputation. But in its details, the devil's in the details. Lots of innocent people are getting done who shouldn't be. And it's based on slavery. It's not based on equality. And so in the story of it, he's just going around being a storyteller. And in my version of telling of the story, he's going around being a storyteller, and it inspires a whole lot of people. But at some stage, somebody jealous is like jealous of how much everybody loves him, and for some reason is tempted by something in himself to put a poison in his drink that will make him hallucinate. So Jesus is out and suddenly he's driven in the streets and he goes into the temple and suddenly he gets really angry. And this guy who was all loving so far, somebody who was jealous of how he was able to be so loving all the time, did something with his free will behind Jesus' back that Jesus didn't know about, so Jesus couldn't be conscious of this thing that came from his blind spot. And that opened up his shadow and he got angry and he took a whip off this guy inside in the church and he started whipping all the people who were doing money changing inside in the church because he was tripped out. Well, he flogged them all out and loads of people saw it happen, and then he was like, oh my God, he suddenly sobered up and went, what have I done? And he fled out of the temple and he ran away.
So is that what happened in the story?
Well,
or is that in your telling?
That's my telling of the story, but as far as I know, that is the story. Like, because the Irish Catholic version of the story is storytelling. The fucker who's in your local pulpit giving mass every week, he's the one who's telling you the story. And if he tells it in a way that's all about Jesus' suffering on the cross and nothing about Jesus' innocence as a child, then he's left out most of the beauty of the story that would speak to the common child, and he's just terrifying the adults with, this could happen to you if you don't do what we tell you. Whereas that's not actually the message that the integral story has, as far as I see it. And so in that integral story there is, life is a poisoned chalice in this world. Somebody will sneak behind your back out of jealousy and poison you, and bad rumour will go around you, and people will make up stories about you. That's something we all experience. We know it's true. If that's what's in the story as to why he ended up getting arrested, then the story makes sense. Because in the 40 days in the desert, he's shown that he's not wanting to be a revolutionary. He's showing that he's not wanting to be king of this material realm. He's showing that he wants to show that we are all the king of our own temples, and that if we run our own lives in accordance with God, then nothing in the outside world can overpower God. Which is to say that the devil is not stronger than God, and that the devil doesn't truly rule the world. It's just that people give themselves to the devil's advice